Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Ron Plain describes the sharp drop in hog prices. Mary Drewnoski talks about finding the optimal time to chop corn silage. Rodrigo Werle explains how cover crops might be able to help manage weeds. And Wayne Woldt discusses emerging uses for drone technologies. University of Missouri Extension economist Ron Plain is our hog market analyst this week. U.S. pork exports through the first 6 months of the year were on pace for their best year ever, with data back to 1989. But numbers from July, released Thursday, might have put a damper on that. American pork shipments last month were down 13% from June and the lowest since February 2016. After a relatively strong July, the last half of August was extremely negative for market prices. In only 10 sessions, the October lean hogs futures contract lost almost 15% and sunk to its worst level in 10 months. We talked with Ron Wednesday morning and began by asking him to describe the recent movements.
Well, we've seen both good and bad this summer. A quick run-up in late spring and some strong prices that fell off fairly fast during the month of August. But all in all, it's a profitable summer for most hog farmers.
Well, what led to this slide recently?
Well, increased slaughter, and we've got more pork on the market, and so that puts some pressure on cutout value. Also, as we moved later into the summer, pork bellies, which is a strong part of the cutout value in the spring, started weaken in August, and that took hog prices down.
Tell me more about the strength in bellies and what that means for the producer.
We set record highs for pork bellies in midsummer. Strong demand for bacon continues, and then we always get a kick in midsummer from the demand for bellies to make bacon for BLT sandwiches. When tomato season comes on, consumption of bacon goes up even more, and so very strong situation, despite the fact we had record hog slaughter for that time of year, therefore record belly supplies.
What's international demand been like? Are they wanting those pork bellies as well, or is it overall for pork?
Well, the demand for bacon is not as strong elsewhere in the world as it is here, but pork demand's good. We're up 12% in pork exports in the first half of this year, and so that's contributed to the overall demand for the product and helped support prices.
Describe some of those markets. What markets is the U.S. doing well in, and which have slipped a little bit?
Well, Mexico continues to be a growth market. They're our biggest foreign customer, and they continue to widen that gap over Japan, which has been fairly steady. Canada is a very consistent market. It's one of the top 5 or so. South Korea has been increasing in their purchases of U.S. pork in recent years, and they bought a lot this summer. A bit disappointing as far as China and Hong Kong purchases. On the flip side, a fast new growing market has been Colombia in South America. They bought a lot of U.S. pork this year so far.
Why is China down?
Their production is down. We'd think that we'd be able to put more pork in, but they're buying a lot of their imports from Western Europe, and I guess political reasons may have something to do in their preference for European pork over U.S. pork.
Well, you had mentioned South Korea. There are reports that the president's looking to withdraw from the free trade agreement with South Korea. Can you describe what that market is like for the U.S. and possible implications?
Well, yes, South Korea is typically the third or fourth largest buyer of U.S. pork. South Korea is a very heavily populated country with a lot of affluent people who can afford to eat meat, and so it's been a growing market for us. We'd sure hate to see something happen to cause that to change, because the outlook is that they'll probably buy more pork from us next year than they've purchased this year, which is more than last year.
Well, let's come back home here. What does USDA expect for production over the rest of 2017?
Well, more pork. They're looking at 4% more pork in the second half of this year. That we were up not quite 3% in the first half of the year. So increased hog slaughter and more pork on the market, that's going to probably put pressure on things, although their forecast has the increase in production a bit higher next year. 3.6% more pork in 2018 is their forecast, up 3.5% this year.
What would you expect seasonally here as we go into fall?
Well, seasonally, weights go up, and with this cool weather in the last few weeks, it's already started up in a lot of locations, and that gives you more pork. Seasonally, we also tend to slaughter more hogs. We have a lot of hogs born in the spring, therefore 6 months later we have a lot of hogs going to market. So look for more pork and more hog slaughter. Fortunately, we've added to kill capacity this week, and our expectation is that prices will stay above year-ago levels.
At least hope in those regional areas with those pork plants?
Yes, Sioux City, Iowa and Coldwater, Michigan are the two locations. It's the plants opened the day after Labor Day. The Michigan plant will probably attract a few pigs out of Ontario, one would expect. The Sioux City plant, mostly U.S. slaughter.
All right, to close out with, tell me what margins have been like and what you might expect here for the rest of the year.
It was a good summer. Hog farmers $14, $15 profit. That's probably going to decline. The fourth quarter is usually least profitable. Probably a little dab of red ink in the fourth quarter. Packer margins have been good with these two new packing plants. We expect things will get tougher for packers as we go ahead.
Next week, DTN's Darren Newsom will join us at Husker Harvest Days to look at the USDA September crop report and its impact on corn and soybean prices. The shape of Nebraska's corn crop is faring slightly better than the country as a whole, according to the USDA's latest progress report. 63% of the state's corn is rated good to excellent, 2 points higher than the U.S. average. While the bulk of harvest is still a few weeks out for most growers in Nebraska, chopping silage could be around the corner. Nebraska Extension's Drewnoski joined us recently to discuss things producers should think about before cutting and storing to get the best possible results.
Well, I think the big thing to think about is getting it cut at the right time, getting it packed, making sure you got it covered, and then making sure you actually get that dry matter into the animal. So managing the feed out and not feeding all those other bacteria and yeast.
So how do you make sure that you do it at the right time?
Well, so the old rule of thumb used to be black layer, right? Well, with the new genetics that we have in corn, black layer is way too dry. And so what we need to do is we can use the indicator of milk line to kind of judge when we need to start testing. But ultimately, the best way is to actually cut whole corn plants and test the dry matter of the whole corn plants. And so we usually say at about 80 to 90% milk line is when you need to start testing. And there's multiple ways you can get it chopped up to test it. Probably one of the most simplistic is to take 5 plants and just essentially chop them up with pruning shears and use a Coster tester or a microwave to get the dry matter content.
But black layer is too late at this point?
Way too late for today's genetics.
Tell me about the storage considerations.
So storage considerations, I would say the number one thing that most people do not do correctly is they don't actually get it packed dense enough. And so we're shooting for at minimum 45 pounds per cubic foot. And so most people are actually much lower than that, and the big reason is because they have the chopper going out in the field. They may have 2 choppers going out in the field and they have 1 pack tractor. And so we need to be essentially packing layers of no more than 6 inches at a time. If you've got 2 choppers, you need 2 pack tractors. And there's actually a formula to figure out how much weight you need on those pack tractors, but the easy way to think about it is I need 800 pounds of tractor for every ton of forage coming in per hour. Most people are way underweighted.
What do they need to know about covering the pile?
Well, covering the pile is something that a lot of people don't do. I'm sure you go around the state, you see that. And I think what they don't realize is how much nutrient content you're losing by not covering it. So if you don't cover it, surface spoilage accounts for about 20% of the dry matter. So essentially, you're throwing away 20% of that feed value. The other part of that is if you don't cover it, we also have that surface layer that's spoiled. Well, that actually negatively affects the bacteria in the rumen. So in addition to losing dry matter content, we're actually losing digestibility because we're affecting the whole diet. And so what we need to do, cover it ASAP. And what that means is not 1 week after you pack it. It really means the same day or at least the next day. Get it packed. There's barrier films that essentially don't allow oxygen to get in. It's a good idea to use those. One of the other things is you see a lot of piles where people are using bales as the sides. That's great, but make sure you're actually putting plastic on the side of those bales because they are porous, air can get through. You'll have surface spoilage on those sides as well, so go ahead and put plastic there. And then the other thing to think about is to think about how do I size that bunker or that pile, and we really need to size it according to how much feed out you're going to have. And so for 100 cows, you know, if you're feeding 15 pounds of dry matter per day, which is pretty average on the corn silage side of it, you're really only looking at maybe a 12-foot high by 10-foot wide bunker. It's a lot smaller than most people do.
And because of that reason, it's critical to manage the feed out?
Yeah, well, the feed out side of it is, it's all about making sure that that surface is not spoiling and you're not just continually feeding spoiled feed. And most people honestly aren't managing that well enough just because of the fact that they have too big of a bunker or too big of a face. We're shooting for 6 to 8 inches of that surface being fed out every day. That's the minimum amount. And so the other side of that feed out is making sure that you're not loosening up material as you go. You want to keep that face intact and you want to keep oxygen from getting into the pile. And so when we think about that, really think about how am I actually getting my forage out of that pile. One of the easiest things to do if you're going to use a front end loader, which a lot of guys do, is to go ahead and just scrape from the top down. It takes more time because you're not digging in, getting a full bucket at once. But in the end, you're going to save a lot of dry matter that way. Again, about another 20% by making sure you're managing feed out properly.
For more information about determining the value of corn silage, you can view our interview with Nebraska Extension educator Aaron Berger from last week's episode of Market Journal. The September Nebraska farmer says Justin McMicken used to go through about 800 bags of ice feeding Nebraska Extension's hail machine. Researchers used the machine to simulate damage for 31 years before giving it back to its original owner, National Crop Insurance Services. So this year, McMicken teamed up with UNL's Biological Systems Engineering Department to build a new and improved version. You can read about how the machine works in the September Nebraska Farmer. With increasing difficulty in handling herbicide-resistant weeds, Nebraska Extension researchers are looking at cover crops as a potential control option. Supporters of cover crops already favor their use for things like capturing nitrogen, controlling water, and improving soil health. At this year's Soybean Management Field Day in North Platte, Nebraska Extension's Rodrigo Werle discussed the possibility of planting shorter season soybean varieties as a way to get a cover crop in the ground earlier. We talked with Rodrigo at the event and began by asking about a survey he conducted earlier this year to find out more about how Nebraska farmers were using cover crops.
Yeah, so that's right, Jeff. Earlier this year, I conducted a cover crop survey at the cover crop conference at the former ARDC near Meade. Most folks that were there were folks that, are already doing cover crops. So it was a good opportunity for me to understand how they are doing it, how they are incorporating cover crops in their different cropping systems, and what they are observing. So one of the main, the first question that I had for them, what have been the benefits associated with cover crops? And the number one by far was erosion control, wind and water erosion control. So that's a tremendous benefit of cover crops there that we're all aware of. The second one, which was a little surprising, is weed suppression. So, you know, folks are noticing that including cover crops as part of their cropping systems have actually improved their overall weed management program. A follow-up question that I had to them, you know, what percentage of producers have noticed improved weed management? And 93% of them have actually noticed that, which is pretty surprising to me.
Yeah, tell me more about that. What kind of weeds are you suppressing and why is it working so well?
Yeah, so as a follow-up question, I asked them, what kind of weeds, you know, are you seeing suppression in your system? And the winter annual weeds were the number one. Okay, so your maristales, your hembits, and so on, those are pretty much kind of go away when you incorporate, you know, especially cereal rye as a cover crop in the fall. And then some have also noticed reduction in early season weeds such as the ragweeds and your kochias, which kind of makes sense. And about 30% of the survey participants have also reported they saw some reduction in the overall pigweed pressure on their farms, you know, and we've been struggling with all these weed species, and any type of suppression you can see out there is going to help you tremendously with your overall weed management program.
You're starting a program here to try to determine if a shorter season soybean variety would allow you to get a cover crop in. Describe the research.
That's absolutely right. So we're working with a different group of researchers, you know, in Lincoln and across the state. We also have researchers in Kentucky and Ohio doing that work. So basically what we're looking at is trying to see whether we can go shorter maturity groups in our soybeans, not have too big of a yield hit, yet give the cover crops a little, you know, more chance to grow in the fall. So the idea is, can we harvest a little sooner if we go with a shorter maturity group, get those cover crops in, and see all the benefits we expect with them without hurting the overall productivity of your system.
Yeah, what are the challenges that you could foresee there?
There's several challenges. I mean, depends on what part of the state you're at. If you're further west, water becomes your biggest concern. You know, I'm going to grow a cover crop, it's going to take water away, so that's a challenge. You know, as you go further east, some of the challenges that producers, you know, made us aware is like timing, having that time to drill the cover crop and, you know, picking the right cover crop, combining cover crops with herbicide programs. So those are the biggest challenges. And then during the soybean, you know, just kind of changing topics a little bit here, but during this few days, you know, going back to cover crops, our idea here is to try to provide canopy, you know, for as long as possible throughout your growing season, because your best weed management program is canopy. Herbicides, they help us get there. So, you know, this is just a concept, you know, trying to go a little bit away from the herbicides. We've had several issues with resistance. The toolbox, you know, there aren't as many options there anymore. So we're trying to diversify the system, perhaps add a little more diversity there, which not only helps with, you know, your weeds, but your overall system.
Kind of in that same arena, how important is termination and selecting which chemicals you're going to use for cover crop termination?
So that's a really good question. Termination is a crucial component of having cover crops. You got to terminate that cover crop at the right time, especially if you're talking corn. You want to make sure you terminate that a little earlier, so then there is no, you know, nitrogen tie-up and all that kind of stuff that might hurt the development, the early season development of your corn. For the soybeans, you can pretty much, you know, green plant them and terminate that, or you know, you can green plant and terminate that at the time of planting. One thing that we recommend producers, if they do that, add the residual and watch the weather, because once you have a residual activity in there, you want to make sure there's water that's going to bring that chemistry down to the ground and get it activated.
You can find more information about using cover crops in Nebraska through our Cover Crops playlist on the Market Journal YouTube channel. About a year ago, the Federal Aviation Administration implemented its rules for pilots of unmanned aircraft systems. As we've heard in previous interviews with those using drones, researchers aren't entirely sure yet how the technology can all be practically used on agricultural operations. We do know scientists are using them to monitor livestock, find herbicide-resistant weeds, and manage water and nitrogen. Last week at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center, we saw Nebraska Extension researchers, including Wayne Woldt, using a drone to learn about a different precision purpose, possibly managing crop diseases or insects from the air.
It is a drone spray aircraft. It's an aerial sprayer, and it's a very new technology. You know, a lot of unmanned aircraft work so far has been geared towards imagery and collecting imaging data and sensing of the crops and such. But now we're moving into interacting with the crops in an active way, and this is geared towards crop protection systems.
What do you hope is the practical use of this?
Well, where we're headed is first we're going to do research on the technology itself. It's a very new aircraft. The way that it flies, the application rate, the application efficiency is going to be key in terms of determining where we go with it. Beyond that, it'll be oriented towards crop protection and the specialists that work in that area.
What are sort of the known unknowns, the things that you're very aware you aren't sure of right now with this device?
Well, this is new enough, and we're just getting started with it, that we know that we don't know very much. And the manufacturer is not able to provide very much information because it's so new. What we want to learn is really one of the key things is application efficiency, but that we start looking at the aircraft itself, the aerodynamics of the aircraft, the altitude that we fly, the airspeed that we're flying, the types of nozzles that we're working with. There's the pressure on the system, where we crank up the pressure on the nozzles. There's a lot of variables that we'll be looking at and working through from a research point of view.
So just for a broad overview, would these be spot applications on either insects or diseases that wouldn't be widespread throughout the field?
Yeah, I think that's what we're looking at, is more towards very precise application for crop protection, whether it's a very early detection of stress or edges or patches, something along that line.
What other things are you doing when it comes to drone work and research on trying to find new uses for them?
Well, we've got a quite active research program now. We're working on wetland characterization for determining the vegetation status, the wildlife status of wetlands, especially during the fall migratory season and the spring migratory season. We're also working on a biosecurity project for animal agriculture, also a variable rate irrigation project where we want to inform variable rate systems with unmanned aircraft. And then kind of a unique one is a more direct kind of interaction with the environment where we're sampling water quality with unmanned aircraft.
How much more have you learned since these became widespread or more widespread?
Well, we've been at it about 5 years now in terms of research and development, and we have learned a lot in these last 5 years. The industry continues to evolve rapidly, though. It's just constantly moving, and we're constantly trying to keep up with it.
What do you hear from producers or those in the agribusiness industry that they have learned or find difficult to use about drones?
Well, what I'm hearing is a lot of interest in unmanned aircraft and what they can do for agriculture. There's a fair amount of uncertainty about rules and regulations, so a lot of what I do in my extension work is helping to inform about rules and regulations and how to fly legally. For example, the aerial application technology here, this spray aircraft, requires some additional certifications to be able to use it legally. And so we're working on that and trying to help producers and consultants understand more about that.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, precipitation free was the name of the game across the state as we are under the influence of high pressure. We did have a cold front that did move through the state, left the precipitation to the north of us, but did bring some very cool conditions into the state during the Wednesday morning time frame. In fact, we did drop below the freezing mark at a couple of our mesonet locations in the western Sandhills and around the Alliance region. Basically temperatures between 30.5 degrees as the minimum to 32 degrees. The Alliance ASOS site at the airport did record a low of 29 degrees, and we did see these type of conditions scattered throughout the upper Midwest. The good news is over this next week we don't worry about much in the way of any cold air coming in. We only concerns of major across the United States is with what will happen with Irma. So as we go to the upper air models, what we are going to notice is high pressure system aloft in the atmosphere will keep us high and dry for the most part. We do have Hurricane Irma coming on shore into the southern portions of Florida. At the surface, high pressure system firmly in control. Just a weak little wind shift line moving through the northern plains. Might generate an isolated sprinkle across northern Nebraska, but I think the atmosphere is too dry for most of it to even make it to the surface. Then we do start to see the ridge building back in as most of the cold air remains bottled up into Canada. Low pressure at the surface, but no moisture for it to work on. Means that we're probably going to see an overplay of the precipitation depicted for east central southeast Nebraska. Heavy precipitation all the way across the southeast as we start to see Irma making its way up into the southeast on Monday. That's where the heavy precipitation with this upper air low will be for our region. High pressure firmly in control and a warming trend for us. We will be well back above normal as Hurricane Irma moves up the eastern seaboard. Heavy precipitation, a little bit of monsoon moisture into the southern Rockies. As we get into Tuesday, high pressure system tries to push eastward, but with Hurricane Irma, it may be stalled out a little bit. The heavier moisture moves into the mid-Mississippi, Tennessee Valley region, in Low Ohio Valley region, and up the eastern seaboard, back into the central plains. We're looking high and dry. As we get into Wednesday, we start to see a trough starting to push its way toward the Great Lakes. This may actually bring in some cooler air to the Great Lakes region, but for our region, we're starting to see low pressure systems develop in the west of us and the east of us, but nothing in the way of moisture for it to work on. Only thing we'll have is the remnants of Irma sitting over the eastern Corn Belt, and we start to see on Thursday this trough deepens somewhat, so we're going to see some cold air moving into the Great Lakes, but for the western Corn Belt, high and dry under the influence of high pressure system aloft. Temperatures easily into the mid-80s, and as we go into Thursday, we start to see some of that monsoon flow coming up from the southwest into the central Rockies, but once again we start to see the ridge building back in, so very warm conditions are on tap for Friday. We do start to see some low pressure systems developing at the surface, and that's going to bring in some stormier weather as we go into late next week and the following week as the system starts to move its way toward the east, but for the meantime moisture remains confined to the desert southwest. In terms of temperatures for next Thursday to the following Tuesday, very cool conditions to our east, warm to our west, and in terms of precipitation, a very dry pattern for the eastern half of the United States. With that trough coming in, it looks like precipitation will start moving in as we get into next weekend.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on hog markets, chopping corn silage, using cover crops, and drone technologies. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Darren Newsom will look at corn and soybean prices, and Rick Rasby will talk about grazing corn stocks. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.